A big warm welcome and thanks for taking some time out of your Wednesday for the Assembly's 2024 election recap event. We've got a very good event lined up for you today and have about 400 or so folks, subscribers who are joining, who are registered today. And so should be a good packed house. We've got 3 different mini panels for you through the next hour, taking a step back and looking at how the 2024 election panned out. It was an interesting one in North Carolina, and we're going to look both at the state level as well as the local level. And you'll hear from John Drescher, who's a senior editor for us at the Assembly, leading a panel on the state level, as well as Kate Sheppard, our managing editor, and Emily McCord, who oversees some of our regional work, and reporters from across the state on each of those panels, diving into the election and what we learned. Before we start, just a quick introduction. My name is Kyle Billman. I'm the founder of the Assembly from about 4 years ago. We've had a journey through the last 4 years, building out this team that includes both state level reporting and regional work in now 4 different regions across North Carolina, including Greensboro, Wilmington, Fayetteville, and the Triangle. And we now have close to 40 folks across the state doing daily, weekly, and deep dive reporting about North Carolina. And it's all possible thanks to everyone on this call. Thanks to the paid subscribers who give a couple dollars each month to help make our work possible. So a big thank you to everyone on this call for helping us do what we do. We couldn't do it without you. Before I turn it over to John to kick off our first panel, just a quick kind of housekeeping note. This is one of our first kind of big virtual events, and we'll be doing a lot more of these throughout 2025. And you may have seen some messaging from us and some notes about premium subscriptions, which a number of folks on this call are now premium subscribers. What that means is that you're paying a few extra dollars a month in order to get access to some additional benefits at the Assembly. And that includes, in the future, moving forward, a number of these events where we will bring in our reporters for conversations and looks behind the scenes, as well as some exclusive newsletters diving into specific industries like higher education, and some additional benefits and additional content over the next year. So really appreciate everyone who has signed up to be a premium subscriber. It helps us pay our reporters, and we are currently thinking about and planning out what we will be able to do and report on and cover over the next year. And your support helps inform that and helps us figure out how many great reporters we can bring on board. So a big thank you to everyone, and let me bring on John Drescher here to kick off our first panel. Again, we'll have 3 panels through the day. We invite you to ask questions in the Q&A that you should see at the bottom of your screen. We won't get to every question, but we will try to get to a lot of them. And without further ado, let me turn it over to John, who was one of the very first team Assembly members and one of our senior editors on the team and oversees a lot of our politics work. John, floor is all yours.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm glad to be here. Look forward to this discussion. And thanks to all of you who are viewing, and thanks for your interest in the Assembly. So as Kyle mentioned, we're going to have 3 panels today. I'm going to lead the first discussion, and I'm going to be joined by 3 reporters who have really done some terrific job. Have done a terrific job in the last year covering the legislative races and the race for governor. And that's Ren Larson, who's in Raleigh, and Jeffrey Billman, who's in Durham, and Joe Killian, who's in Greensboro. So if they're all on now, I'll start with the questioning. And there's Ren.
Hello.
So I'm going to start with you, Ren. First question is, Republicans still have a supermajority in the state Senate. But Democrats have broken the supermajority in the House, but only by one vote. So, what does this mean for the relationship between Democratic Governor-elect Josh Stein and the Republicans who will continue to control the legislature?
Yeah. So for those who do not keep tabs on all of the numbers, in North Carolina's General Assembly, we have 50 state senators and 120 state representatives. And so Republicans have secured a supermajority in the state House, and they have 71 of the 120 seats in the state Senate, one seat shy of that supermajority, the 3/5 rule. And so what I would expect for the beginning of the 2025 session is for it to be no different than what we saw in the first few months of 2023. And those were the first few months before Representative Tricia Cotham switched from Democrat to Republican. Republicans will need to find just one legislator in the state House to work with them to override a veto that the governor would pass. And what I would expect is we're going to have Republicans in our state legislature who are not working with either the minority leader in the state House or the governor, because it's just a lot easier to peel back one or two representatives from their party in order to get a bill to pass.
So let's talk about who those one or two or three might be. So Republicans to override a gubernatorial veto in the House will need to pick up, assuming all members are present, will need to pick up a Democratic vote. So who are they most likely to target to vote with them on some key pieces of legislation?
Yeah, so these are names that are well known to members of the legislature. You have Representative Cecil Brockman, who's out of High Point, Representative Carla Cunningham, who's in Northern Mecklenburg, Representative Shelley Willingham, who's in Edgecombe County, and Representative Garland Pierce in Scotland County. And these are representatives who, with the exception of Representative Pierce, come from solidly Democratic districts. And they've been known to work with Republicans on key bills. We used to have another name on this list, Representative Michael Ray, and he lost his primary to Representative-elect Rodney Pierce. You might need to look for a few newcomers too. We had a number of new members elected to the state House, but the people who won on the narrowest margins were also people who ran on tickets about breaking the supermajority.
Got it. Thanks. Jeffrey, want to turn to you now. You and Joe have done a lot of great reporting on Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, who lost his race for governor by about 15 points. A Republican consultant recently told you that the Robinson wipeout was an embarrassment for the party and said there are a lot of donors that are aggravated right now. What are you hearing about whether Republican leaders will be more aggressive in recruiting and vetting candidates for statewide office in 2028?
So there's sort of a divide from what I've heard within, folks who do this in the party about the role that what you might call the establishment should play. I mean, is it their job to sort of appoint and direct funds to, candidates versus letting it sort of sort out in a natural primary? And I think even a lot of folks who, thought Robinson was kind of a disaster don't see the party's role as being that kind of like, backroom deal, kingmaker kind of position. But I mean, I also think it gets into this question of, what is the Republican establishment now, right? Like and whether it's any different from the base. And I think, quite frankly, over the last decade or so, the Republican base has become, in a lot of ways, its establishment. They're sort of one and the same in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but the base just nominated a candidate for governor who flamed out. So does that put the leadership in a position of trying to prevent that from happening again, or not?
Hold on, sorry. My dog just got frisky. So I think that I don't know, actually. I mean, I don't know if they know, to be quite frank. whether they can do that or not. Like, I don't know if they know whether they can, what could they have done to stop Mark Robinson? He had Trump's endorsement. He had, the sort of grassroots was behind him. If they had gotten behind another candidate, I don't know that it would have mattered.
Okay. Joe, question for you while we're on the subject of Robinson. Do you see him running again?
I do. First of all, he and his wife were in a terrible financial state before they entered politics. Between investigations into her now abandoned nonprofit and some outstanding campaign finance questions, it's entirely possible that they could end up there again. But more importantly, anybody who knows Mark Robinson, from the people he used to hang out with in porn shops here in Greensboro to people who have only known him in politics, know that he's primarily looking for a stage. That's what he wants. If you read his autobiography, he didn't get into politics to pass legislation. He didn't get into politics to impact state politics. He really got into politics because he wanted to give speeches and he wanted to pontificate about culture war issues. And if he wants to do that in the future, he's going to have to stay relevant politically. And so I think that another run, probably for Senate, is probably inevitable.
And how would you see that? What would a Republican primary, assuming Senator Tillis runs for re-election, what would a Republican primary look like if Robinson challenged Tillis?
Well, I mean, as Jeff said, I think I think nobody really knows, but we're gonna find out. We've got another Trump administration coming about. But the thing to remember too is that, Robinson's political future may be determined by Trump. Trump basically let him dangle in this thing after all of the porn stuff came out that we reported and CNN. He started saying, "Oh, I don't know anything about that campaign. I don't know." He didn't throw him a life preserver, and so if he does that again, I don't know that he's going to have. If he doesn't have the backing of Trump, I don't know how much chance he has.
Let me throw out a question for any or all of you, and that is, do the Republican leaders in the legislature, do they really care if they have a Republican governor or not?
I've been saying for years, I think that frankly they prefer not to have a Republican governor. The last time that this Republican majority had a Republican governor was Pat McCrory, and they spent almost the entirety of his one term in office fighting with him in and out of court. And I think as long as they can bring a few Democrats over on big votes and overturn vetoes, and they've proven that they can do that even when there isn't a technical supermajority, that it may be better for them actually to have a Democrat in the governor's mansion to sort of act as a political foil.
I think Joe's right.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I
Go
mean,
ahead.
I was going to say that if they did have supermajorities, they would absolutely feel like they're in a better place with Stein than with Robinson. If they had Robinson for the next 4 years, they'd have to own everything he said, anything he did that was, offensive or whatever, they would have to answer for it. And with Stein, if something goes wrong, they got someone to blame.
So I'm going to ask a few reader questions now, and this is for any of you that want to take it. On which issues do you think there is some consensus between Republicans and Democrats? Are there any?
I think we're going to see a lot of consensus with reinvesting in Western North Carolina. I think that disaster relief is something that is generally supported. We have this political boundary that unites us. We have a desire to reinvest in our coastal areas, and we also are going to see a lot of money flowing to Western North Carolina.
Jeff, Joe, do you see any other potential areas where Stein and Democrats might find consensus with Republicans?
Well, I think that one thing that Stein has sort of been out there on as AG is the opioid crisis, and that's very important to Republicans as well. Serious opioid problems in some red areas of our state, and they seem to both be on the same page in terms of increasing the ability of the state government to go after some of those things, and also funding initiatives to help out with that.
I also don't think you'll see any movement on the window to access an abortion in North Carolina over the next 2 years. I think that there are other reproductive health care issues that might come forward, but I don't think that there is from Republicans, an appetite to further winnow that. Obviously, I'm sure with Democrats, there's a window to, there's appetite to bring abortion access back to 20 weeks. But in that regard, there'll probably be an agreement for no movement there.
Well, Ren, you anticipated a reader question, which was right along those lines. Another reader question or viewer question related to the upcoming session. Is there an opportunity to overturn laws that have passed, such as the private school vouchers?
Not really. Not unless Republicans will decided to. I mean, the referendum process in North Carolina requires, unlike a lot of states, requires the legislature to put an issue on the ballot. So if the legislature doesn't feel like overturning its own laws, it's not going to go on the ballot.
Yeah. And with something like vouchers, that's one of those wedge issues that Republicans can always peel off a couple of Democratic votes for, and they don't have to necessarily be very conservative Democrats. They, in many cases, they've been Black Democrats who feel that public schools are failing their constituents and they're willing to try something else. And so, yeah, I would think it'd be pretty unlikely that they'd roll that back.
Let me go to another question here from a viewer. I keep seeing news coverage that North Carolina has voted for a Democratic governor and a Republican president repeatedly over the years, but nobody has explained why. What's y'all's explanation for that?
I mean, I'll take this unless someone else wants it. I mean, I think it's a bit like North Carolina always voted for Democratic governors, except for what, 3 or 4 times in the last, I don't know, century and a half, or since the late 1900s. I mean, it was a traditionally Democratic state, even when it was conservative. And so, you had sort of this kind of populist mode of Democrat that was kind of culturally conservative, but also, progressive on infrastructure and on, education and things like that. And that was there for a long time. The state has polarized a bit more in the last several, decades, but I think there's still that kind of bipartisan streak. And quite frankly, I mean, Republicans probably could have won had they won the governorship, had they run a better candidate this time around.
Yeah, political scientist told me, I think it was Chris Cooper. I'm going to credit him with him, even if it wasn't, that a lot of North Carolinians, feel connected to their state government and they have some sense of what's happening in their state, and their federal government is something that happens on television. And it's farther away, they have more contempt for it, and they're more likely to feel comfortable throwing a grenade in that direction. And so, how I could have talked to as many people on election day as I did who voted for Josh Stein, but also voted for Donald Trump, is an enduring mystery. If you think about it, like, let's sit down and go over all of these issues and do they have to align? Less so if people are thinking differently about their federal government than they are about their state government.
All right, we're getting a lot of questions here from readers/viewers, which is great. So here's the next one. In addition to the governor's race, the legislature will see new leadership in the speaker's office. What do you anticipate might be different in the working relationship between Stein, Destin Hall, who's the presumed speaker, and Berger, compared to Governor Cooper, Moore, and Berger, which saw a number of stalemates between the chambers? So basically, how do you see the fact that there's new leadership on the House Speaker, and assuming that it's Destin Hall, how do you see the relationship between the House, the Senate, and the governor changing?
Who do we want to do it? Ren, you wanna take this one?
I don't know Dustin as well as you do, Jeffrey.
Well, okay. My sense is that the main difference, I think, is that my sense is that Destin Hall is better liked than Tim Moore is, just on a sort of personal level. I don't see the dynamic changing all that much, to be perfectly honest. I think the incentive structures are there for, conflict. I think most of Stein's work is going to be oppositional. I think that a lot of and Republicans are going to put forward a lot of things that he'll end up vetoing, and they'll try to override. I think that the fundamental dynamic of the legislature won't change very much.
And Joe, how about the relationship between Governor-elect Stein and the legislature compared to the relationship with Governor Cooper and the legislature?
Well, in some ways, Stein and Cooper are similar. They both started off in the legislature, became attorney general. Josh Stein has been out of the legislative fray since 2016, but he has had this oppositional relationship with the legislature in terms of them, trying to successfully removing him as their representative, the legal representative for the state. They've hired outside lawyers that they've gone back and forth with him on these things. I think that, an interesting thing to watch will be, the degree, and this has to do with the relationship, whether he's going to have a lot of success keeping Democrats together in the legislature. When it's one vote, there's the difference between, sustaining a veto and not sustaining a veto. You got to have that sort of like Lyndon Johnson level of influence and savvy and muscle. And I just don't know that he's got that. I don't think that it was evident that Roy Cooper, really couldn't do that on some very important things when there was a very slim margin or no margin at all. So it'll be interesting to see, what, if any, difference there is with Stein on that.
Two things I'm watching in the state house with the change in speaker are more process oriented that will actually be really interesting to see how they shake out. One of them is Speaker Moore wouldn't bring any bill forward that he didn't have a majority of Republicans and consensus on it. And so, we didn't see actions, bills reaching the floor that would have passed in the state house, just because, there was enough of a consensus, say, on whether it be changes in happy hour policies, or even like gambling legalization, where you have Democrats and Republicans from within each party finding some middle ground, but there is also conservatives within each party that wouldn't support it. So I'm watching there. I'm also really interested in how our budget process will move forward. In addition to a change in the speaker, we also have a change in, we have one of the head budget writers who has left the House. And so we can expect to see something different there.
Ren, you've done some reporting about what's likely to happen in the session next year, but we should also point out that we do have the legislature coming back this month, so there still is an opportunity for the current legislature to take action on some measures. As was mentioned previously, Republican-dominated legislature has tried to strip powers from the governor, even when they had a Republican governor.
Mhm.
Would you expect them to try to find more things to take away from Governor Stein and future governors in the 2025 session?
I mean, another Chris Cooper reference, since he's getting an honorary position on this panel. He said to me, he's like, what powers are there left to strip from the governor? At some point, you're naked. And so there could be certain changes, certain things that a governor has explicit power over, sole power over in the executive branch, that the legislature might also want to have more authority. I imagine the remaining like 6 weeks in our session will mostly be dedicated towards Western North Carolina, and then overriding a veto while there is still time. And then next session, current Majority Leader John Bell in the State House mentioned that there's going to be a lot of bandwidth spent trying to find new opportunities for revenue. We're going to have a budgetary shortfall, not this next session, but the year after, the session after. And so we're going to be discussing legalizing things like medical marijuana, hemp, trying to figure out what type of gambling legislation is palatable for the state ledge.
All right, we're going to take one last question from a viewer. And this question is, in the era of Citizens United, dark money groups, and the dominant influence of unaccountable social media platforms. How much do the political parties themselves really matter?
I mean, parties as infrastructure are weak. I mean, they've been weak for years, and they're getting weaker. I mean, I think ever since, since Citizens United and all that, they've just been having actually getting political parties to do things or to have any sort of force within their own movement is difficult, and that's one of the reasons why the Republican base was able to sort of take over the Republican establishment. And I think there's some movement on that end toward on the Democratic side as well. But no, the parties themselves are weak, and their sort of gatekeeping function is diminished considerably.
Got it. We got time for, I think, for one more question. Several readers, viewers have asked the question that basically is, do you see any chance for the legislature in the 25-26 session to increase K through 12 public school funding?
I mean, I think that I'd love to hear what everybody else has to say, but I think that the trend line is not toward more public school funding. I think it's both the Republican majority and enough Democrats to make a difference are for more vouchers. They're for more private school funding. And so I won't say that it couldn't happen, but I don't it doesn't appear to be trending that way to me. How about you guys?
Well, I mean, they always. It's just a matter of degrees, right? It's never going to be the amount that like Leandro called for, the Leandro ruling, or what the teachers groups want and all that. I mean, they do tend to increase funding by 2, 3, 4% every year, depending on what the budget looks like. I suspect they'll continue to do that. I wouldn't expect that education would get cut in real terms. I think it might get cut in terms of like compared to inflation. I don't know if it'll keep up with inflation and keep up with cost of living, but I do expect that at least in nominal terms, it'll continue to increase.
From
Well,
the
there's
school
also spending.
choice,
Sorry, go ahead.
from the school choice advocates, I keep hearing that, money follows the student. And so anytime you have a student leaving the district, then you have less money going to that district, your public schools. And so there's that potential that, say, the legislature will have a policy that on paper looks like it could increase funding for education, brings a lot more funding for education, but that won't, if it's increasing per pupil allocations, that might equally or more, it might actually favor private schools and charter schools more than it would favor traditional public schools. I do think there could be more money for teacher pay coming through. I think that's a possibility. There's been, our education system has been docked in some business reporting because of low teacher pay and turnover there.
All right, this has been a great discussion. For those of you who are watching, this is just the first of 3 panels. So thanks to Ren and Jeff and Joe. And now I'm going to introduce Managing Editor Kate Sheppard, who's going to be with reporters Michael Hewlett and Carli Brosseau, and they're going to talk about the Council of State races and the judicial races. So Kate, we'll take it over from here.
Hello, thank you all for joining. And that was a great discussion. And I will also say that there were tons of great questions that we didn't get to. I will try to get to some of those in our panel, but let's, without further ado, introduce our 2 panelists. Michael Hewlett covers courts and criminal justice for us, and Carli Brosseau is an enterprise reporter who covers all kinds of stuff. We're going to talk about Council of State and courts and some of the interesting and surprising things they saw out in their reporting this election. Let's start out with you, Carli. I think one of the races a lot of us were watching closely was the superintendent of public instruction race. Michelle Morrow surprised everyone by winning the primary and then ran a pretty tight race with Mo Green. What were your takeaways from that race?
I think there is a contrast to be drawn with the Mark Robinson race. I mean, like Mark Robinson, Michelle Morrow faced many kind of mini scandals of her own based on her past comments, some of which were also written up by CNN. Many of those comments were violent, or at least alluding to violence. And she didn't appear to pay the same electoral penalty as he did independently. I've heard others say, and I think there is some merit to it, that she did face a penalty for being associated with Robinson and was kind of brought down by his scandals. You can see that she didn't do as well as some of the other Republican candidates who are running for council of state races. She did about as well as the other candidates who chose not to disavow Robinson in the last days of the campaign. So I think there's some parallels there. I'm also really interested in how some of the dynamics of local school board races could have affected Michelle Morrow's performance. I was following the school board race in Moore County, which has been a place that sort of tested out a lot of the ideas that Michelle Morrow was promoting at a statewide level, including these culture war issues, targeting transgender students, and education about race and gender. And those candidates, there were 4 seats up for election this time. And generally speaking, the proponents of that agenda lost. There's still a lot of provisional ballots out, so it's possible that we might see some changes, but the general takeaway for me was that that agenda did not get a resounding kind of mark of approval by voters.
Michael, another big council of state race was the Jeff Jackson-Dan Bishop matchup. What were your observations about that contest? And what do you think it says about what people want from the AG's office in North Carolina?
So the interesting thing about the AG's race is it's been under Democratic control for most of this century. I think the last Republican elected to Attorney General was back in the late 1800s. And so the Republicans have been trying to break that little chokehold that Democrats had. And I think Dan Bishop was trying to do that, and he failed. This race was a little quieter than people thought, considering the fact that you had 2 congressmen battling it out, and you particularly had Jeff Jackson, who's very well known on TikTok, running for office. I don't know how much people really understand what the AG's office does, but the race ended up being about, well, if you elect me, I'll handle crime, I'll handle immigration. At least specifically, that's what Dan Bishop was trying to run on. Like the superintendent race, Democrats were really doing a big job of trying to tie Dan Bishop to Mark Robinson, which was easy because Dan Bishop had been out there supporting Mark Robinson, saying he wanted to be Mark Robinson's sidekick. And it appears that that hurt him when it came to the AG's race. He lost by a wider margin than other Republican candidates for AGs in previous races.
And I guess to follow up there, which is, I think that there's always this assumption that like Republican candidates are the so-quote law and order candidates. Do you think that just doesn't hold water in North Carolina, or that people are looking for something different in that office?
It's kind of hard to tell. I mean, because the AG's office doesn't really, it really supports DAs in their appeals. The AG can advise law enforcement, but they don't really make any kind of policy regarding what law enforcement does.
Okay, to pivot once again, Carli, another race that you followed was for lieutenant governor. That race doesn't usually get a lot of attention, but of course, this year we had a lieutenant governor running for the executive mansion, and we had a very famous name in state politics on the Democratic side of the ballot. What does that race tell us about the future of that office here in North Carolina?
I think the great interest in the race suggests that there's a whole bunch of interest in the bully pulpit that that office can provide, and that Mark Robinson demonstrated that it could provide, not only in the platform to run for governor, but just sort of what issues you can spotlight in that position. I think from speaking with Rachel Hunt that she was very interested in that bully pulpit. I think she has a lot of ideas for what issues she wants to highlight. Some of them are reproductive justice. Her first ad in the campaign was about protecting the standards under Roe, and what the loss of those protections might mean. She's also spoken about other sort of women and children related issues like childcare, like maternal mortality, healthcare more broadly. Also issues for rural residents. She really campaigned as somebody who sort of understands rural issues, kind of hearkening back to her father, her upbringing and her father's time in the governor's mansion. And you know, as we saw with Governor McCrory and Lieutenant Governor Forrest, even when the lieutenant governor and the governor don't share the same party, there can be a lot of disagreement between them, and a lot of what the lieutenant governor can do depends on what the governor will allow them to do or facilitate them doing. And in that case, it wasn't an awful lot. Forrest sort of had to make his own agenda because McCrory was not eager to give him very much of a portfolio. So I think it remains to be seen how Stein and Hunt will work together. I'll be interested to see that. The other thing that I thought was really interesting in what Hunt was saying during the campaign was that she was very interested in exerting influence over the legislature through that role of presiding over the Senate. I think the sort of bounds of what you can do in that are yet to be tested and could just be something interesting to watch.
And then I will go to audience questions after this one, but Michael, you were also watching the courts races in the state, including Supreme Court and Court of Appeals. Those races seem to go a lot better for the Republican candidates. From your reporting, what do you think is going on there? And obviously the Supreme Court race is still not quite called. So what are you watching as that one continues to play out?
So the state Supreme Court race has been really interesting. You have Allison Riggs, the Democratic incumbent, running against Jefferson Griffin. And right now, even on election night, it was flip-flopping. It was so close. And now Allison Riggs is not conceded. It is down to a difference of about 7,700 votes between the two. And that's coming from a high of about 10,000 votes on election night. And so Riggs has not conceded. She's monitoring the results. She may end up requesting a recount by next week. We don't know. They're still counting absentee ballots, which seem to be so far in her favor, and counting provisional ballots, which Jefferson Griffin so far is winning. The Supreme Court race has also been interesting because the Democrats are trying to reverse them losing the court in November of 2022. So the state Supreme Court is 5-2. Allison Riggs is hoping to keep her seat and keep that 5-2. In 2 years, Anita Earls, who's the other Democratic incumbent, will be running. And then in 2028, if everything holds still, if all the dominoes fall in the right place, they may have an opportunity to flip the court back into Democratic control. But it just depends on how that first domino falls. The Republicans had much better election night with the Court of Appeals. It was already 11-4, and it's now 13-2. So the Republican incumbent Valerie Zachary won her seat. The Democratic incumbent lost her seat, and then there was an open seat that the Republican won.
Okay, let's take a question from the audience. This one's from an anonymous attendee, but I'm curious about it, what you all think. What chances do you think there are for Michelle Morrow and Dan Bishop or other North Carolina losing candidates on the Council of State to end up as appointees in the Trump administration?
I think Bishop probably has a shot. He's already a congressman. He is a member of the House Freedom Caucus. He has positioned himself as one of the most conservative members of Congress, an avid culture warrior. He was the sponsor of HB2. I'm sure that he is angling for a position in the Trump administration.
mean, Michelle Morrow put out an email and also messages on social media saying that she, had been nominated for a position. It seems like that was a sort of regular person nomination to a platform that RFK was running related to possible posts in the administration, and she's told some news outlets that she hasn't actually spoken with anyone in DC. So I don't know how to evaluate that exactly. Some of the candidates who have been named finalists or possible US education secretaries, might have some connections with Morrow. I'm not as familiar, but Virginia Fox is one of those people from North Carolina, and Tiffany Justice of Moms for Liberty has also been named. So it's possible she could build a connection there, but I don't think there's any evidence at this point that she has.
Another question from audience member David Chatham. Now that this election is over, how will you be approaching your future reporting? Different beats, different geographies, different types of content. He has some further questions here, but I'm curious for you too. How are you focusing your energy coming out of last week?
I am still focused on what I'm most interested in is what the state Supreme Court will rule in December. Their final rulings for the year will be coming out in December. One of the things that people are looking at is if they're going to rule on Leandro. They're revisiting that case, determining whether or what kind of role the state will have in terms of funding public education. And there are some other issues related to criminal justice reform. I have covered lots of cases dealing with jury discrimination and other things.
One of the issues that I'm interested in looking at is sort of what are the dimensions of the new plans for immigration at the state level, whether that is the role of sheriffs, including some sheriffs in North Carolina who have been very vocal in the past about supporting Trump's immigration agenda in his previous term. And, the legislature has teed up an override on its legislation relating to kind of trying to force sheriff's hands in cooperating more fully with ICE. So kind of tracking the dimensions of that, who the players are, and what the next stage of that policy area will be, something I'm looking at.
Okay, our time is up, unfortunately. I know there are a lot of great questions still in the queue. I will go in and answer some of those where you can type the answers as well to the best of my ability. But thank you to Michael and to Carli. I'm going to hand it off now to Emily McCord, who is our senior regional editor, who will introduce her panelists.
Hello, and thank you so much for being here. I am the senior regional editor here at the Assembly, and I want to introduce our panel. We're going to be talking about how local partners and local newsrooms can cover State House races. And want to introduce the members of our team. Meta Devarajan is the interim editor-in-chief at City View in Fayetteville, one of our partners here. Also want to introduce Johanna Still, who is a reporter with the Assembly, and she's at the helm of The Dive, which is our Wilmington, North Carolina newsletter, and Chase Pellegrini DePore, a reporter at Indie Week in Durham. Thanks, y'all, for being here. Appreciate it. All right, so I'm going to start out, and of course, want to give some time to answer your questions too. So to kick it off, Johanna, are all the races decided, or is there still some ballot counting happening, and what's at stake there?
Yeah, in Wilmington, which is New Hanover County, it's very much a purple county, reflects the state as a whole. Neither party can truly claim victory in New Hanover County. So every election season, it's a real duking it out between the parties. Here locally, we have a ballot counting sort of fiasco brewing. I say fiasco because there's just a lot of controversy swirling around the fact that there are 1,500 roughly 1,500 absentee ballots that are still outstanding that haven't been counted. Now, the controversy is in the county government. County administration is very frustrated with the fact that these ballots weren't counted. And of course, the State Board of Elections has come back to say, this is fairly typical. Election staff get overworked, overloaded this time of year, and that this kind of counting after the fact is very normal. Now, the 1,500 absentee ballots that are outstanding in New Hanover County, they could potentially swing some local races. Mail-in ballots typically or recently have been benefiting Democrats over Republicans by about 2 to 1. So people do expect so that some of these races might flip. That includes the school board and the county commission. And that represents roughly 15,000 overall mail-in ballots that are still yet to be counted statewide.
You know, one of the continued themes, I think, when it comes to covering these statewide races is how, in certain ways, how unsurprising the outcomes are, right? Given the makeup of our districts. And Maida, I'll kick it off to you first, but how has that shaped local coverage?
Definitely, yeah. So here in Cumberland County, we have 6 seats, 4 in the state house and 2 in the state senate. And of those 6 seats, 5 incumbents ran for election, and even within that group, 1 person ran unopposed. So in some ways, that made things kind of easy for us on election night. Our districts in Cumberland County are pretty heavily gerrymandered. You know, so the only new person elected to the state legislature was a Democrat who replaced a seat that was held by Representative Marvin Lucas, who was in that seat for many years before he retired, and also a Democrat. Broadly, for context, you know, Cumberland County is relatively blue. We have close to 89,000 registered Democrats compared to 52,000 registered Republicans. We also have nearly as many unaffiliated voters as we do Democrats, and I think that kind of speaks to some of the split tickets we see down ballot in Cumberland County and across the state. Also interesting to note that Trump performed 2 points better this year against this year against Kamala Harris than he did against Biden in 2020. Although the county still, 55% of voters went for Harris this year.
Johanna, I'd be curious if you could weigh in on that. I know Wilmington's been experiencing many of those same dynamics as well.
Yeah, we have our most competitive legislative race was District 7, which is Michael Lee. He's a Republican. He's held that seat for a while, but the seat itself is competitive, and it has some gerrymandering in downtown Wilmington. So this carve out that's called the Wilmington Notch, it takes roughly, I think it's like 15,000 votes that are, basically thrown into the Republican areas of Brunswick and Columbus. Sorry if I'm misspeaking on the other rural county, but effectively Michael Lee's district is gerrymandered. However, even with the gerrymander, it's still super competitive. The Democrats think they have a chance. They actually flipped it in 2018 with just 231 votes. So that race, even though the Republicans favor it, it's still really competitive down here.
One of the stories, and we were touching on this earlier during the webinar, but that we're all collectively unpacking, right, is how people voted. Where did they go? Chase, I'm curious, at Indy Week covers a large swath of an urban core of North Carolina, more Democrats and progressives in the areas of your readership. I'm curious how Wake County fared and what sort of could be read from the tea leaves there.
Yeah, first I'll note, like you said, we cover mostly Durham, Wake, and Orange counties. Durham goes for Democrats by about 80%, with about 80%, and Orange goes with about 75%, whereas Wake is still generally blue, but that'll be in the 60s rather than the 80s like Durham. The most interesting results out of Wake were in the results of their bond referenda at all these different levels of government. So all across the triangle, you had counties and municipalities asking their voters to approve often tax increases so that they could have services like parks, better libraries, things like that. In most of these situations, they were approved pretty overwhelmingly. But over in Wake County, while the countywide library referendum was approved, the Cary local bonds were both voted down. Part of that may have just been that the town was asking for about $600 million for various projects, whereas the other bonds were around 100 or under. So that might have been some of it, but it could also speak to just the difference in the voters there.
I mean, I'd like to throw that at you because Cumberland County is an urban area, but you also have large rural areas nearby. It's a strong military culture. So what stories have you been looking at to understand how voters make these choices?
Totally, yeah. like you mentioned, Fayetteville, we have this huge military population with Fort Liberty, formerly known as Fort Bragg, and it's the biggest military base by population in the country. And a lot of veterans often retire in Cumberland County or the surrounding areas, Pinehurst, Moore County, Rayford. And so Daniel Johnson wrote a great story for the Assembly a few weeks ago about the military vote and the efforts that candidates across both parties are making to reach those voters. And so, in a nutshell, I think the military vote is traditionally seen as Republican or more conservative, but the research could be a bit more consistent. So, like even on a national level, we had two presidential candidates who really emphasized their military backgrounds. And here in North Carolina, our new Attorney General, Jeff Jackson, is a Democrat who made efforts to underscore his military background while campaigning. And so I think looking ahead, that's definitely something we'll keep exploring and parsing through, particularly as the research shows that the veteran vote might be more of a mixed bag when it comes to demographics like race or gender. And I think especially it'll be really interesting to see how newly elected officials target issues like veteran healthcare and homelessness, since those are issues that really came to the surface a lot in Daniel's story and in our reporting, when we're out and about at campaign during election season, talking to voters at these events. So I think it'll definitely be interesting for us in Cumberland County with, like you mentioned, this kind of unique population we've got.
Thanks, Maida. All of our newsrooms, of course, are looking at these, vitally important local races. And I know we have some questions that have come in since then as well. And I want to get to that in just a minute. But I think this idea of vote splitting, right? And this idea of, people going in all these different directions. How does that affect candidates down the ballot, and what could that mean for future elections? Joe, I'll pick on you first.
I think that it's something that we're going to have a piece on this coming out tomorrow in the dive, and so stay tuned for that. But I think that it's really interesting. Vote splitting, what we've heard from Michael Bitzer, who's leading political scientist at Catawba College, is that it's part of our DNA, right? So our voters here in North Carolina, he said a roughly 5 to 6% slice of the electorate is what you would say reliably vote splitting. So they are picking and choosing. They're not total loyalists. And so there's a lot of attention, and rightfully so. I'm fascinated by it too, by the rise of the unaffiliated voter. But often we learn that unaffiliated voters are actually partisans, or they maybe aren't, they aren't totally allegiant to one party, but they are mostly allegiant to a certain side. And so there's a very small slice that's truly independent, and they go both ways. And then, aside from those, you also have voters that choose to go different ways. And I think that the outcome with the Mark Robinson race is a perfect example of that. There was a lot of ballot roll-off, which means that basically you would have you would have voters who would vote for president. So maybe they voted for Trump, but they didn't vote for Stein, and they didn't vote for Robinson. They just left it blank. And so that kind of roll off and voters choosing not to go that way makes a difference too. So there's lots of different, there's lots of different factors going on. And of course, when these phenomena are happening at the local level, they can play out in different ways.
I want to get to one of the questions from an anonymous attendee. How can we amplify and share local stories, such as school board initiatives? These stories often don't get much attention. Chase, you are covering education at Indie Week. Wondering if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I would just say, read Indie Week, of course, but also, share that with your friends and your coworkers. If you see something that's, not being covered, throw that up in your Facebook groups or send it in your group chats. I think, the Triangle has a lot of media covering local races like that. A lot of other places in North Carolina don't. I don't know. I don't think I have the answer to that as an industry problem, to be honest. But yeah, at a local level, I would just say keep doing your best to pay attention. I don't know.
What about you, Maida? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I think that's something that engaged with a lot of, maybe Chase can speak to that too, but a lot of people I think who are in our voter demographic who sometimes have kind of a nihilistic perspective on how they can engage in their community. And I think a lot of folks often just don't know how much control local boards have over your day-to-day life. Just as an anecdote, it's not totally about education, but we have in Cumberland County, we had a race up this year, the Soil and Water District Board of Supervisors, which sounds like a particularly, it can be kind of mundane, but this year we had some kind of exciting and unique candidates who ran, and the incumbent lost. She was the current chairperson and the chairperson of a 9-county region. And so I think that is really, speaks to the value of like engaging with things like when there are local candidate forums, like you should go and listen and hear what your representatives have to say. Like if there are public comment periods during meetings, like show up and find out what your local boards are talking about, because they can impact things that, I think we don't totally comprehend all the time and can get lost in this haze of national media.
Thanks, Maida. Chase, I have a question for you, and because I know you reported on this, and this is from Ravi, who wrote in that said, what's next for the North Carolina constitutional amendment that was on the ballot and that requires the citizenship to vote? If you want to give us a quick debrief on that and what you think is next there.
Yes, I'll start by just saying, honestly, I do not know what is next. I have a bunch of emails out right now, and I actually have a big document that says what's next for the constitutional amendment, because I don't know. So I'm waiting for smarter people to tell me the answer to that. But I can just rewind and give a little background on that if you guys like. There was the statewide constitutional amendment referendum on the ballot this year, and it passed overwhelmingly to change the language of the state constitution to say that only citizens could vote, whereas before it had said pretty much that every citizen could vote. A lot of people had different opinions on what that exactly meant. But here in the Triangle, a bunch of the progressive representatives came out against it pretty strong. And I think as a result of that, when you look at the statewide map, every county of the 100 counties in North Carolina, 98 voted of a majority in favor of it. And only Durham and Orange voted with a majority against it, which I thought was a little fun tidbit. But as for where that's going, I do not know yet, but stay tuned. Good question.
Well, I will leave some room for an additional question or two, but while we're about to wrap up, I am curious what all of you in your different teams, what are you going to be covering next? What are you going to be following in the aftermath of the election?
I can jump in and start with this. Because of how blue and how at the local levels in Durham and Orange and a lot of Wake, how democratic it is here, a lot of the conversations I've been hearing have been, how do these local boards and bodies respond to the changing federal administration? When you look at even how they responded to a Republican supermajority in the past year has been interesting. When you look at school boards, some of them think that it's better to, loudly advocate for the students that they feel are being pushed aside by these legislatures and the federal administration, while other boards think it's better to sort of lay low and keep the attention off of them and just quietly continue to do what they've been doing. So I think in the future, we'll be seeing a lot of how do these ultra blue areas respond to the Trump administration.
I would say the two things I'm looking out for is one, what the actual results are for our local elections, because some are still undetermined territory, the ones that were closer. And then two, I'd really love to dig back into the data. I did a data analysis of the electorate. We published it right before the election, and I would like to dig back into the data once the final canvas is over next week. And I'm particularly interested in the gender kind of divide, how things are breaking down there, and then of course other demographic trends.
I know we're at time, but real quick, I think for us in Cumberland County, we'll certainly be looking at the military vote to break that down. We talk about how it's a bit more complex than we might think, and so kind of really looking at the data is something that I think we'll be interested in. And like Chase mentioned earlier, for us in Cumberland County, I think some of the big issues that define our day-to-day is water contamination with forever chemicals. And like I mentioned, with our big, better in population healthcare, we're in a healthcare desert. And so I think, as we talk about in this change of hands of the federal government, potential rollbacks in public health and environmental protections, really looking at how that'll impact us on a local level is something that we have our eye on.
Maida, Johanna, Chase, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to, a quick item housekeeping that I want to let you know that earlier this year we rolled out our premium subscription, which is a new tier of benefits that offers deeper reporting on important issues in the state. And that includes premium-only newsletters and events, and a 20% discount on our merch store, which is very exciting. Right now, we're offering a 50% discount on our premium subscription. So if you like what you see, we're going to have more of this. Our next one is in January, and it's about what to expect during the legislative session. So join us for that. Thank you so much for all of your support and for being subscribers and for joining us today. And you can always reach out. All of our contact information is on our website. And if you have any story ideas, we'd love to hear from you. That's at scoops@theassemblync.com. We'd love to hear your tips and ideas. Again, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.